In the quiet heart of Belgium during the 1990s, a story emerged that would haunt an entire nation. Behind the peaceful streets and charming towns, something unthinkable was happening, something that would reveal the dark side of human nature and expose how fragile justice can be. This is not just the story of one man's crimes, but of a nation forced to confront its own failures. Mark Dutroux, a name that still sends shivers down the spine of Europe, lived an ordinary life on the outside, but beneath that image was a man driven by greed, control, and cruelty. When his crimes came to light, they did not just shock Belgium, they shattered trust in the very institutions meant to protect its citizens. Police mistakes, lost evidence, and unanswered questions created a scandal that would grow far beyond one criminal. What happened in Belgium during those years was not only about fear, it was about awakening. It was about parents demanding answers, citizens marching in unity, and a nation realizing that silence and neglect can be as dangerous as evil itself. In this video, we will uncover how this case unfolded, why it took so long for the truth to surface, and how the legacy of these events still shapes Belgium today. This is a story of tragedy, justice, and the power of ordinary people who refuse to look away. If you care about truth, accountability, and history that teaches us to never repeat the same mistakes, do not forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the stories that remind us how darkness can rise when good people stay silent. Long before the world came to know his name, Mark Dutroux had already begun walking a path that would one day reveal the creaks within Belgium's system of justice. His story did not start with a single shocking act, but with a series of smaller transgressions, each one ignored or lightly punished, each one allowing him to move a step closer to the horror that was yet to come. In the 1980s, Dutroux was no stranger to police files. He had already been charged with crimes that spoke of control and cruelty, involving those who could not defend themselves. The courts had the chance to keep him away from society, yet each time, the system faltered. What should have been warnings became missed opportunities, and every release only emboldened him further. He was clever enough to appear harmless, a man who knew how to play the system and manipulate those around him, behind doors. However, he was methodically building his world a place where he could act without consequence. After serving a fraction of his sentence for serious offenses, Dutroux was released early, a decision that would later haunt the nation. The logic behind it was rooted in misplaced optimism, the belief that a person could easily be rehabilitated, that mercy was always preferable to caution. Yet mercy, in this case, became a deadly mistake. Upon his release, he returned to a quiet neighborhood, living with his wife, Michelle Martin, who would later become an accomplice in his future crimes. Outwardly, their life seemed unremarkable. He tinkered with cars, worked odd jobs, and collected government assistance meant for those unable to find work. But beneath that facade, he was already planning, driven by twisted impulses and an obsession with control. His earlier time in prison had not reformed him, it had taught him how to be more careful, more deceptive, more calculating. The files on Dutroux's previous offenses should have raised alarms in every office that handled them. His victims had spoken, their stories documented in painful detail, but bureaucracy and indifference buried the warnings beneath stacks of forgotten paperwork. When reports surfaced that he was building secret rooms in his house, they were dismissed as rumors. Even when he purchased multiple properties with no clear source of income, no one questioned how an unemployed man could afford them. The system was blind, and in that blindness, it failed the very people it was created to protect. Belgium at that time was not prepared to face what would later emerge. The justice system was slow, fragmented, and underfunded. with communication gaps between courts and police departments that allowed dangerous individuals to slip through unnoticed. Dutroux's release was not simply the result of leniency, it was the product of a structure that had grown too comfortable, too trusting, too confident that evil of this kind could not exist within its borders. Yet, as history would show, complacency can be its own form of complicity. As Dutroux rebuilt his life outside prison walls, he began crafting an illusion of normality. Neighbors saw a quiet man, sometimes even generous, who kept to himself. No one could have imagined that behind locked doors and thick concrete walls, he was preparing spaces that would soon become scenes of unimaginable suffering. His past had already written the warning signs in bold letters. But no one had been reading. By the time authorities realized their mistake, it was far too late. The second chance he was given became a death sentence for others. And when the truth finally emerged, Belgium was left to ask itself how a man with such a history could have been allowed to walk free not once, but repeatedly. The answer lay not in one person's failure, but in a system that had forgotten the simplest duty of all, to protect the innocent before it is too late. The years that followed Dutroux's release revealed a nightmare that no one could have imagined. Behind the walls of his quiet home, hidden beneath layers of concrete and secrecy, he constructed something that turned ordinary houses into prisons. Beneath the floors and behind reinforced doors, he built narrow chambers designed to conceal the unimaginable. To the outside world, these buildings were unremarkable, simple properties in unassuming neighborhoods, but to those trapped inside, they became places of despair where time stood still and the world above seemed to forget them. Dutroux's actions were not spontaneous. They were calculated, deliberate, and terrifyingly methodical. Each abduction was planned with precision. He watched, waited, and selected his victims with cold patience. The girls he targeted were young, innocent, and full of life, unaware that they had been noticed by a man who saw them only as part of his twisted desires for control. Once they disappeared, their families searched desperately, while Dutroux hid them away in the depths of his secret world, where cries could not escape and hope slowly faded into silence. What made these events even more chilling was that he did not act alone. His wife, Michelle Martin, played a role that would later shock the nation. She knew what was happening behind those closed doors, and though she could have stopped it, she chose not to. Whether it was fear, dependence, or shared guilt, her silence became as powerful as his cruelty. Together, they formed a disturbing partnership, one that thrived in secrecy and manipulation. Dutroux also enlisted other accomplices who helped him in small but vital ways, watching his victims, helping with transportation, or turning a blind eye when questions arose. Each of them, in their own way, became part of a web of complicity that allowed the horror to continue. Inside those hidden rooms, life became a cruel illusion of survival. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. The victims, isolated and terrified, clung to the hope that someone would find them. Food was scarce, the air was heavy, and the narrow spaces offered no comfort. The walls themselves seemed to absorb their voices, keeping every whisper locked within. Dutroux controlled every aspect of their existence, deciding when they could eat, when they could see light, when they could speak. His need for dominance consumed him completely, erasing any trace of humanity left in him. Outside, families searched relentlessly, posting photographs, pleading with the public, and demanding answers from the police. Yet the investigations were plagued by confusion and disorganization. Reports were filed, witnesses came forward, but somehow the connections were never made. The same system that had once released him now failed to recognize that the danger had returned. In those crucial months when lives could have been saved, the silence of bureaucracy echoed louder than the cries of the missing. When the truth finally began to surface, The scale of what had happened was almost too heavy to grasp. The discoveries made inside his properties revealed not just the suffering of those who had been taken, but also the staggering negligence that had allowed it all to happen. It was a moment that shook Belgium to its core, not only because of the cruelty of one man, but because of what it said about the fragility of the structures meant to protect society. The story of those secret chambers is not only one of loss, but also of awakening. It exposed the cost of complacency and the danger of believing that evil always announces itself. Sometimes it hides behind ordinary walls, wearing the face of a neighbor, moving through the same streets, unnoticed until it is far too late. And in the quiet darkness beneath those homes, Belgium was forced to confront a truth that would change it forever. As the hidden horrors within Dutroux's homes slowly came to light, the focus inevitably turned to the institutions that had allowed such atrocities to continue. Reports from neighbors, informants, and even family members had painted a clear picture of a man operating far beyond the limits of law and morality. Yet the response from authorities was staggeringly inadequate. Each tip that could have led to the rescue of innocent girls seemed to vanish into an endless cycle of bureaucracy, miscommunication, and apparent indifference, leaving the public in disbelief and deepening the sense of betrayal that grew with every passing day. Police files, notes from magistrates, and recorded warnings suggested that Dutroux was a known threat long before the full extent of his crimes was revealed. But for reasons that would later horrify the nation, those warnings were ignored. Informants had described the construction of hidden chambers, the abduction plans, and even the direct involvement of accomplices. Yet these details were left unexamined or buried under procedural delays. Each opportunity to intervene was missed. And with every misstep, the victims' chances of survival diminished. Families, desperate and pleading, were met with excuses, inconsistencies, and a chilling lack of urgency that transformed grief into outrage. As the investigation faltered, questions began to surface about the potential reasons behind this extraordinary failure. Whispers of corruption circulated among the press and public, suggesting that Dutroux may have enjoyed protection from networks reaching into the political and judicial system itself. These allegations were fueled by inconsistencies in how leads were handled, delays in executing warrants, and the unusual dismissals and transfers of key investigators. Even those who worked tirelessly to uncover the truth faced obstacles that appeared not accidental but systemic, as if some unseen forces were determined to allow Dutroux's activities to continue unchecked. The idea that the machinery of justice, designed to protect the most vulnerable, could be so compromised shook the nation to its core. Public frustration mounted as each revelation emerged, and it became clear that the negligence was not simply an isolated failure, but a reflection of deeper structural issues. Citizens demanded accountability, asking why lives could be so carelessly endangered, why warnings had been ignored, and why so much trust had been placed in a system that repeatedly failed them. Demonstrations and protests erupted across Belgium, drawing tens of thousands into the streets, united not only in grief for the victims, but in outrage at the perceived betrayal of their trust. These gatherings were both mourning and demand, a statement that the failures of the past would not be accepted quietly, and a call for reform that could no longer be delayed. Behind doors, internal investigations struggled to reconcile the extent of the oversight with the severity of the crimes. Judges, police officers, and prosecutors were scrutinized, and as the public learned of repeated errors and inexplicable delays, the sense of national shock turned into fury. The case revealed not only individual incompetence, but a frightening pattern of systemic failure, where warnings were dismissed, connections overlooked, and lives endangered due to inertia, fear, or complicity. Each revelation served as a painful reminder that justice, when slow or obstructed, could compound suffering rather than prevent it. The Dutroux case ultimately became a mirror reflecting the vulnerabilities within Belgium's justice system. It demonstrated how even clear evidence, repeated warnings, and international scrutiny could be rendered ineffective by institutional shortcomings. In the aftermath, the nation confronted a painful truth. The suffering of the victims was inseparable from the failures of those entrusted to protect them. And the outrage that followed was not merely emotional, but a demand for a society capable of responding with vigilance, responsibility, and unwavering moral clarity. This reckoning would leave a lasting imprint, driving reforms and reshaping public expectations of justice for generations to come. As the grim details of Dutroux's crimes became impossible to ignore, the collective grief and anger of the Belgian people erupted into one of the most powerful demonstrations in the nation's recent history. An event that would come to be remembered as the White March. What began as private sorrow and whispered outrage among families and neighbors quickly transformed into a visible, determined movement that spilled into the streets, bringing together citizens from all walks of life who shared a single, unshakable demand: justice, accountability, and reform. The streets of Brussels became a sea of white, a symbol of innocence and mourning, as more than 300,000 people gathered in solemn yet resolute procession. Their presence a message that the failures of the authorities would no longer be tolerated. The march was not merely a protest, it was a national reckoning. A collective voice demanding answers for the preventable suffering endured by innocent children and their families. Parents of victims walked alongside citizens who had never met them, their hands intertwined in solidarity, their eyes reflecting a mixture of sorrow and unyielding determination. Every step taken was a silent rebuke to the authorities whose inaction had allowed Dutroux to continue his crimes, whose negligence and oversight had turned isolated tragedies into a national crisis. The White March became both a tribute to those lost and a warning to the system that accountability could no longer be delayed or denied. News cameras and international reporters captured the immense scale and unity of the march, amplifying the impact of the event far beyond Belgium's borders. Public sentiment, already raw from the shocking failures of the police and judiciary, now transformed into organized outrage with a clear purpose: systemic reform. Participants carried banners and signs calling for transparency in the justice system, demanding reforms to prevent the recurrence of such oversights, and urging the government to recognize that public trust, once broken, required decisive action to restore. The march's significance lay not only in its size but in the moral weight it carried. It was a demonstration that society itself would not remain passive in the face of injustice. The White March also marked a turning point in the political landscape, as the sheer scale of public pressure compelled government officials to confront the deficiencies laid bare by the Dutroux case. Ministers and police authorities, previously insulated by bureaucracy and procedural conventions, were forced into public accountability, acknowledging failures that had previously been ignored or minimized. The movement catalyzed legislative reviews and discussions about judicial reform, parole procedures, and the oversight of law enforcement, illustrating the power of collective civic action in shaping national policy. For many citizens, walking in the march was an act of personal and communal agency, a way to reclaim moral authority and insist that the suffering of children be neither overlooked nor repeated. The emotional resonance of the White March lingered long after the streets were emptied. Families who had lost children, survivors of Dutroux captivity, and ordinary citizens who had marched together shared a renewed sense of vigilance and shared responsibility for the society they inhabited. The symbolic act of walking side by side in white attire transformed grief into purpose, channeling anger and sorrow into a collective demand for ethical, transparent, and accountable governance. It was a reminder that the fight against injustice required more than law enforcement alone. It required active public engagement and an unwavering insistence that institutions serve their fundamental role in protecting the innocent. Ultimately, the White March became a defining moment in Belgian history, a convergence of grief, outrage, and determination that forced the nation to confront its systemic failings while sending a powerful message to the world. No crime against the most vulnerable could be ignored without consequence. And the strength of a society is measured not only by its laws, but by the courage of its people to demand justice when those laws fail. The march served as both a memorial and a catalyst, etching the lessons of the Dutroux case into the national consciousness and reshaping the expectations of accountability for generations to come. The legacy of the Dutroux case is a somber reminder of how unchecked negligence, systemic flaws, and human malfeasance can converge to allow unspeakable horrors to occur. In the aftermath of the investigation, trial, and national outcry, Belgium was compelled to confront the very institutions that had failed its citizens. The judicial and law enforcement systems, once criticized for incompetence, lack of coordination, and bureaucratic inefficiency, underwent significant restructuring aimed at preventing such catastrophic oversights from ever happening again. Police forces were reorganized, communication channels between investigative units were strengthened, and procedures for monitoring and managing offenders were overhauled, reflecting a hard-earned commitment to accountability. Yet, beyond institutional reform, the Dutroux case left an enduring mark on the national psyche. For many Belgians, the scandal was more than a story of individual evil. It was a mirror reflecting vulnerabilities in society, a stark exposure of how a system designed to protect its citizens could instead fail the most vulnerable among them. Families of victims, survivors, and the broader public had to grapple with the emotional and societal consequences. Confronting grief, anger, and the difficult reality that reforms often come only in response to tragedy. The case sparked conversations that extended far beyond Belgium's borders, prompting nations across Europe to examine their own legal and protective frameworks for children, and serving as a cautionary tale about the potential human cost of systemic failure and complacency. Today, the Dutroux case stands as one of Europe's darkest criminal scandals, a chilling account of cruelty compounded by bureaucratic failure. Yet, it is also a story of resilience, of a society that refused to remain passive in the face of injustice, and of the urgent necessity for vigilance, transparency, and ethical responsibility in the institutions entrusted to safeguard the public. The lessons of Dutroux resonate not only in legal reforms and institutional changes but in the enduring awareness that the protection of the innocent requires constant diligence, moral courage, and societal engagement. As we reflect on this harrowing story, we are reminded that the work of justice is never complete, and that collective action, whether through demanding accountability, supporting reforms, or remaining informed, is essential in preventing such tragedies in the future. The Dutroux case compels us to remain alert, to question authority when necessary, and to ensure that systems intended to protect do not become instruments of neglect. Thank you for watching and joining us as we explored this difficult but crucial chapter in modern European history. If you found this story compelling and want to support our efforts to bring important historical and investigative content to light, please make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you won't miss our future explorations into significant historical events and their lessons for today. Together, we can continue learning from the past and fostering awareness that helps build a safer, more accountable society.